Well, good to catch up again, Peter, and here to chat about your new book, Prodigal Pilgrim, Letters to Pope Francis from Lourdes, Fatima, Garabandal and Medjugorje. Congratulations.
Thanks, Frank.
I notice it's dedicated to Father Vincent Doyle. Could you tell us something about him?
Yes, Father Vincent Doyle was a Lismore priest, and he was in the same class in the seminary as Tom Keneally. And he died about 5 years ago, but he left behind an organisation called the Our Lady of the Angelus Community. And this community has been active, I was involved in it 20 years ago, and in fact wrote the constitution for it, and it's a public company with tax deductibility status.
Right.
So he was a good friend of mine. He was the parish priest of Byron Bay for quite a long time, and I was on the parish council with him, and so he was the obvious person to dedicate a book about Mary to, because he was a great devotee of Mary and especially the Marian apparitions.
Right. So I think I first met you when you were in the New South Wales Parliament, and you were agitating for human rights, not only in New South Wales but nationally.
I'd written a book about why we should have a Bill of Rights. I'd worked previously, before I was in Parliament, I'd worked for the Fitzgerald Royal Commission in Queensland, and I was actually in charge of writing the proposed Queensland Bill of Rights.
Well, you can imagine my surprise when I found that you, having been a politician and agitating for human rights, were interested in writing a book about pilgrimages to Mary.
I've always been interested in the idea of Marian apparitions, you know, the bewildering idea that some person from 2,000 years ago might somehow magically appear in the modern world. It's an extraordinary phenomenon. And I went to Rome 30 years ago in order to check it out, as it were, and I've been interested ever since.
Yes, I've found during COVID, when I've been a relieving hospital chaplain, particularly when giving the last rites, people, they love to be able to pray to Mary, and even doing anointings or whatever, but to pray the Hail Mary with people, and particularly coming to that stage of, you know, being with us now and at the hour of our death, when that hour is very proximate. It's got a real poignancy to it.
It's a devotion that I treasure.
Well, I, being a Jesuit, of course, have been schooled in the spiritual exercises of Ignatius Loyola. And in his spiritual exercises, he often has the exercitant offer a colloquy, first to Mary, then to Jesus, and then to the Father. And Ignatius clearly sees Mary as a way by which we can gain entrance to dialogue with Jesus and then with the Father. So that part of it resonates pretty readily for me.
Yes.
But I have to say I'm one of those 21st century Christians or Catholics for whom I've been able to get by in life without trading too much on apparitions by Mary. So could you share with us something of the vitality that you've drawn, first of all, from just reading about the apparitions?
When I think about the apparitions and devotion to Mary, I do it through the writings of other people like Maximilian Kolbe and like Louis de Montfort, who wrote extensively about the relationship between Mary and the Holy Spirit. And it seemed to me that that any relationship with God through Mary is quite legitimate. I mean, it's not Mariolatry. It is, you know, going through somebody else to God, just as if you were going to see the Premier or the President. You know, you wouldn't just ring up and go direct, you'd go through someone in their office or someone connected to them. And that's how I feel about Mary, you know. She is a channel through which I can talk to God, you know.
I thought for this interview, why don't we just focus on Fatima, because it's come back into the public consciousness, hasn't it, with
Yes.
Pope Francis's recent consecration of Ukraine and Russia. So, first of all, could you just give us a thumbnail sketch of the actual apparitions that were enjoyed by those 3 children at Fatima?
Right, so the apparitions occurred over a period of 6 months in 1917. Between the 2 Russian wars, the October Revolution and the February war against the Tsar. And Mary's discussions with 3 children focused on this question of when the war would end, because they were in the middle of the First World War. And the whole population was completely traumatised by the First World War. Plus, of course, there was the virus that was going around in those days, this, what they called the Spanish flu, which killed something like 50 million people. So it was a very traumatic time. And the idea that Mary would be appearing in a place, a remote place, to 3 young children actually caused quite a scandal. But people became convinced by the phenomena that they experienced at Fatima. There were predictions made about the spinning sun, for example, and there were other predictions made about the war and about the consecration of Russia. And Mary is said to have told these children that if they prayed and if they did penance, then Russia would be the war would end and Russia would be converted.
In the book, there's a rhythm, if you like, of Fatima and Lourdes and Garabandal and Medjugorje, where, I mean, you recount what were the apparitions. You then recount something of your own journeys to these places, and then, being the lawyer that you are, I suppose, there's then the correspondence where you write to the Pope after each of these journeys. Yes. In terms of your own journey to Fatima, could you tell us just a little about that?
Yes, so I had read about Fatima, and in 1989 I travelled to Rome, and I knew Morris West, the writer, and Morris West gave me a letter of introduction to a woman named Marjorie Weeks, who was in charge of Vatican communications at the time. And she was a great fan of Morris West, so when I handed her this letter from Morris West, she just waltzed me straight into the Vatican. And we went through a maze of corridors, and we came into a room, and he was the Pope, Pope John Paul, talking to a group of bishops from Africa. And she put a ticket in my pocket to say that I was a journalist and put a camera on my shoulder, and she said, "You stand over there with those journalists, and I'll talk to you later."
And then travelling to Fatima?
Well, the odd thing that happened was that Marjorie Weeks said, "Look, before you write a word about Fatima, you need to go to Medjugorje." And I said, "I'd never heard of Medjugorje. What is that?" She said, "That's a place in Bosnia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, where a lady is currently appearing to 6 young children." And, you know, I was totally stunned about that. So I said, all right, I took her advice. I went to Fatima, but then I travelled on to Medjugorje. And what I discovered at Medjugorje is that the so-called prophecies that had happened at Fatima were being perpetuated, if you like, at Medjugorje. And the children were saying that Our Lady was saying, yes, that the Fatima prophecies are linked to the Medjugorje prophecies. So needless to say, I became interested in the more current apparitions, those of Medjugorje.
And what did you gain by way of insight as a result of your journeys and then your writings and your reflections?
When I got to Medjugorje and became interested in Medjugorje, the children firstly were older. There were 6 of them, and not just one. There was really only one at Fatima, Sister Lucia, because the other 2 didn't communicate with the apparition. Whereas at Medjugorje there are 6 of them. They're now grown up. They're in their 40s and 50s. They have families of their own. They're not nuns and priests. So as a layman, the Medjugorje apparitions have held my interest.
Now, I note that even though you've been on this spiritual journey, you've maintained your interest in human rights and in matters to do with politics. I was thinking American readers might be interested in a couple of observations you made about Mr. Biden. I notice you wrote at one stage, "Meanwhile, Holy Father, you might want to mention to the faithful that Joe Biden is entitled to live his faith without being harassed by the US bishops, the same men who promote the big lie that the number one social justice issue is the destruction of the unborn in the womb. Other than their credibility, it costs the bishops nothing to keep repeating the lie, while the real number one social justice issue, poverty, costs serious money to alleviate." They're pretty stirring words, Peter, and I dare say there'd be a lot of people who are inspired by Marian devotion who might disagree with you on the political assessment. What do you say to that?
Well, look, Frank, I'm not surprised that people would disagree with that assessment. Joe Biden is not everyone's cup of tea, but he's a very good Catholic. And it's something of an anomaly that a man who's such a good Catholic has views that, well, I could describe them as progressive political views, but his views on abortion aren't really very well understood. He's in a difficult position in the Democratic Party, and his views on abortion were expressed in a book he wrote in 2007, and the book was called Promises to Keep. And he's very clear in that book that he's not a supporter of abortion. What he does support, though, is the woman's right to decide, certainly early on in the first trimester. It's the woman's body, she's carrying the fetus, it's her entitlement. You reach a point where I think he would say, well, this is now a separate life, it has a soul, so, different rules apply. But, Joe Biden is not as black and white as he's often portrayed on this abortion question. And it's a difficult question.
Yes. And I notice also in the book, Cardinal Pell from Australia, but well known to Americans as well, features quite a number of times. In fact, you say at the beginning of the book, it was actually the conviction of Cardinal Pell on child sexual abuse charges that led to your feeling deeply shocked and ashamed about all of this, and that you thought you should set out on pilgrimage.
Yes.
And it was only later, of course, when he was completely acquitted by the High Court, that you then had cause to revise yet again your opinion of him. But you do say in the book that you had some correspondence with him during the course of your writing of the book and during his legal travails. Would you like to share with us something of that correspondence?
Yes, sure. I actually got to know Cardinal Pell quite well when I was in Parliament. He was the patron of the Thomas More Society, of which I was a member. And we had lots of interesting discussions, and we had lots of correspondence. I used to say things in Parliament that Fred Nile disagreed with. And Fred Nile used to copy my speeches and send them to the Cardinal and complain that a Catholic was standing up in Parliament saying things that were obviously contrary to the faith. And so the Cardinal, with the best will in the world, would communicate with me about what may well have been an error on my part about various things, such as making decisions based on my constituents' views of how the world goes round rather than the Church's view of how the world goes round, and also on questions such as primacy of conscience and climate change, which are things that Cardinal Pell dismisses out of hand. He says there's no such thing as primacy of conscience, and if there is, it ought to be thrown out. And on the question of climate change, the climate's always changed, and he's waiting for the next ice age. So, Cardinal Pell and I have some disagreements, but we actually get on quite well. We enjoy each other's company. We don't have many opportunities these days, but I was terribly distressed and shocked when he was charged over child sex offences. He was the last person that I thought would have been culpable for that type of activity.
I should have asked you, Peter, what do you think of the Pope's act of consecration of Russia and Ukraine? Is that consistent with what was revealed at Fatima?
Well, interestingly, the Pope didn't mention Fatima in the consecration. The bishop's media release mentioned it, but the Pope's consecration said nothing about Fatima. And there's a strong body of opinion in the church that says that the Fatima prophecies have already been fulfilled, that Russia was converted in 1991 when the Soviet Union broke up, and the only thing that we haven't had is peace. So it's arguable that Russia needs to be converted twice, because we still need to have Our Lady's promise of peace fulfilled, and regrettably, the Soviet Union's gone, but we now have a new dictator in Russia, so Russia also needs to be converted.
Well, let's hope there can be peace once again on the earth.
And thank you so much for
Thank you.
agreeing to have this interview. It's, as I said to you on the phone, it's above and beyond the call of duty. And all my friends who said that Father Brennan will never talk to you in a million years, I can now tell them that they're wrong.
Happy to talk to anyone.
Thank you.
Thanks indeed.